the bluestone city of Casila, nestled in the heart of Aquamar's northern continent, stood as a testament to ancient engineering and spiritual devotion. For 3 millennia, its cobblestone streets had echoed with tales of Zarok, the colossal guardian dragon, whose iridescent scales matched the turquoise hues of the city's architecture. The people of Casila lived by a simple code: honor the guardian, follow the rituals, and stay alive. Caleb Grayson had no interest in any of those things when his ship crashed into the Crimson Wastes, just beyond Casila's eastern wall. A rogue pilot with a talent for trouble, Caleb had been fleeing from space pirates when their particle cannon clipped his starboard engine. As he stumbled from the smoking wreckage, brushing dust from his worn leather jacket, his only concern was finding parts to repair his ship before the pirates tracked him down. The horizon shimmered with heat as Caleb squinted at the distant silhouette of Casila. Alien cities were always a gamble. Some welcomed outsiders with open arms. Others served them up as the main course at dinner. Either way, it beat dying of dehydration in what looked like a crimson desert. 3 hours of trudging later, Caleb reached the imposing gates of Casila. The smooth, polished stones of the wall rose nearly 30 feet high, inlaid with swirling patterns that seemed to move if you stared too long. Guards in ceremonial armor eyed him suspiciously, but allowed him entry after a cursory search. "Keep your voice down near the eastern quarter," one guard warned in broken universal standard. "Guardian rests there." Caleb gave a mock salute and slipped into the city, immediately struck by the strange dichotomy of the place. Despite the seemingly medieval architecture, citizens moved about with small devices hovering at their shoulders, local tech that seemed both primitive and advanced simultaneously. The air smelled of unfamiliar spices and something metallic that tickled the back of his throat. He made his way toward what appeared to be a marketplace, hoping to find information about ship parts and perhaps something to drink. The market square bustled with activity. Vendors called out in languages his translator struggled to interpret, selling everything from crystalline fruits to what looked suspiciously like mechanical organs. Caleb approached a stall, selling what he hoped was water, reaching for his credit chip. That's when he heard the first scream. The sound cut through the market chatter like a blade. One scream became many, and suddenly the crowded square transformed into chaos. People scattered, abandoning their goods and fleeing toward the western quarter of the city. "Guardian comes! Guardian comes!" someone shouted. Curious despite himself, Caleb moved against the tide of fleeing citizens. He rounded a corner into a wide avenue and froze. Zarok was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Nearly 60 feet long from snout to tail, the dragon's body was covered in scales the color of a tropical ocean, each one the size of Caleb's hand. Its wings, currently folded against its massive body, occasionally fluttered, sending gusts of wind that knocked over abandoned market stalls. 6 eyes, arranged in 2 vertical rows on each side of its elongated head, glowed with an inner fire. The cause of the panic became immediately apparent. A merchant caravan had been caught in the open when Zarok emerged from whatever lair it inhabited. 5 wagons lay in splinters, their contents scattered across the cobblestones. The merchant group huddled against a wall, terror evident in their postures as the dragon sniffed the wreckage. Citizens watched from windows and alleyways, none daring to intervene. A group of robed figures, clearly some sort of religious order, stood at the far end of the avenue, chanting and waving ceremonial staffs, but they maintained a healthy distance from the beast. The dragon reared back, its massive maw opening to reveal rows of teeth like polished daggers. One of the merchants broke from the group in panic, running blindly, directly toward where Caleb stood. What happened next was pure instinct, the kind of reckless impulse that had defined Caleb's life. As the merchant ran past him, Caleb stepped forward into the avenue, directly into Zarok's line of sight. The dragon paused, all 6 eyes swiveling to focus on this new presence. Caleb raised his hand. the gesture he'd used countless times with the guard dogs on the mining colony where he'd grown up. "Sit," he commanded firmly, voice carrying across the suddenly silent avenue. To the astonishment of everyone present, Caleb included, the enormous dragon slowly lowered its hindquarters to the cobblestones with a sound like grinding boulders. Its tail curled around its body, and it tilted its massive head, regarding Caleb with what could only be described as curiosity. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the stone buildings. Then, from somewhere behind him, Caleb heard a feminine voice, filled with equal parts shock and outrage. "Did you just tame our guardian human?" Caleb turned to find the source of the voice. She stood apart from the robed chanters, though her attire marked her as one of them. Her skin had the faintest blue tint common to aquamarines, but her eyes were what caught his attention, the same iridescent turquoise as the dragon's scales, with vertical pupils that narrowed as she studied him. A circlet of what appeared to be dragon scales adorned her forehead, and her robes, unlike the plain garments of her companions, were embroidered with intricate symbols. "I wouldn't call it taming," Caleb replied with a shrug. "More like suggesting." The woman approached slowly, her gaze flickering between Caleb and the still-seated Zarok. The crowd began to emerge from hiding, a circle of onlookers forming at a respectful distance. "No outsider speaks to the Guardian. No one commands Zarok." She circled him, eyes narrow with suspicion. "I am Tiara, High Priestess of the Dragon Keepers. For 3,000 years, my bloodline alone has communicated with the Guardian." Caleb glanced at the dragon, which was now watching them both with what appeared to be amusement. "Seems like we're both having an unusual day then." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Caleb noticed the merchant group taking advantage of the distraction to flee, but the citizens of Casila were drawing closer, fascination overcoming fear. "This is impossible," Tiara muttered, then raised her voice. "Zarok, return to your sanctuary." The dragon didn't move, its gaze still fixed on Caleb. "Please," Caleb added with a half-smile. The dragon rose, stretched like an enormous cat, and with a great beating of wings that sent dust swirling through the avenue, launched itself skyward. It circled once overhead before disappearing behind the eastern buildings. The crowd erupted in exclamations and pointed fingers. Tiara's face had drained of color, the blue tint of her skin now pale as morning mist. "You must come with me," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The High Keeper must see this." Before Caleb could respond, he found himself surrounded by the robed chanters, who had abandoned their ceremonial staffs and now gripped his arms with surprising strength. Tiara led the way through the winding streets, the crowd parting before them like water around a stone. They arrived at what could only be described as a temple, a circular structure of the same blue stone as the rest of the city, but polished to a mirror shine. Great columns supported a domed roof, and between each column hung tapestries depicting dragons in various poses of majesty and battle. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense. The main chamber was circular, with a sunken center where a fire burned in a pit shaped like a dragon's eye. Around this pit, stone benches rose in concentric circles. Seated on the highest bench was an elderly man with skin so deeply blue it was almost black, his robes more elaborate than even Tiara's. "High Keeper Valdris," Tiara announced, bowing deeply. "I bring before you an outsider who has communicated with Zarok." The old man's eyes, clouded with age but still alert, fixed on Caleb. "Approach, outsider." Caleb was nudged forward until he stood at the edge of the fire pit. The flames cast dancing shadows across the chamber, making the dragon tapestries seem alive. "Tell me exactly what transpired," Valdris commanded. Caleb recounted the events in the avenue, keeping his explanations simple and direct. As he spoke, more robed figures entered the chamber, filling the stone benches. By the time he finished, Nearly 100 pairs of eyes were watching him, with expressions ranging from wonder to outright hostility. Valdris stroked his long, white beard. In 3,000 years of recorded history, Zarak has acknowledged only the Dragon Keepers, and even then, only those of the sacred bloodline. He gestured to Tiara. What you claim defies our most fundamental beliefs. With respect, High Keeper, Tiara interjected. I witnessed it myself. Zarak obeyed his command. A coincidence, came a harsh voice from the temple entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered man in military garb strode into the chamber, metal armor plates clinking with each step. The Guardian was simply finished with its inspection of the merchant goods. Captain Vex, Valdris acknowledged with a nod. Your input is noted, but Priestess Tiara's word carries weight in matters concerning the Guardian. Vex scowled, his hand resting on the hilt of a ceremonial sword. The prophecy speaks of the dual Guardian, one who will bridge worlds. This. He waved dismissively at Caleb. Vagrant is hardly the fulfillment of ancient prediction. There's a simple way to determine the truth, Tiara said, her voice carrying a challenge. The flight of faith. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Even Valdris looked taken aback. The ritual has not been performed in 7 generations, he cautioned. What's the flight of faith? Caleb asked, increasingly aware that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple crash landing. Tiara turned to him, her turquoise eyes intense. You will ride Zarak, without saddle, without restraint. If you truly have a connection with the Guardian, you will survive the flight. If not, she left the consequence unspoken. That sounds unnecessarily dramatic, Caleb replied with a nervous laugh, and also completely insane. The alternative, Captain Vex said with a cold smile, is imprisonment for interfering with sacred traditions. The penalty for such sacrilege is quite severe. Caleb looked between the stern captain and the enigmatic priestess. When you put it that way, a dragon ride sounds delightful. When do we start? At dusk, Valdris declared, rising from his seat. Prepare the outsider for the ritual. Caleb found himself led to a small chamber adjoining the main temple hall. The room contained a simple cot, a basin of water, and a window that offered a view of the eastern quarter, where Zarak had disappeared. This is crazy, he muttered to himself as the door closed behind him. Completely, absolutely crazy. He'd just settled on the cot, contemplating the series of poor life choices that had led him to this moment. When the door opened again, Tiara entered, carrying a bundle of fabric. These are ceremonial robes, she explained, placing them at the foot of the cot. They're woven with scales shed by Zarak, offering some protection against the heat of his body. Caleb eyed the garments skeptically. Why are you doing this? You could have just let Captain Sunshine throw me in a cell. Tiara sat on the edge of the cot, her formal demeanor faltering slightly. The prophecy Vex mentioned. It speaks of a time when Zarak would acknowledge one not of our world. It foretells great change. She glanced toward the window. For 7 generations, my family has served as Zarak's voice to our people. We've interpreted his actions, maintained the rituals. But recently, Zarak has grown. Restless. Unpredictable. Like destroying merchant caravans? She nodded. That behavior began only 3 cycles ago. Before that, Zarak was a protector, keeping predators from the crimson wastes at bay, warning us of storms. Her fingers traced one of the scales woven into the robes. Something is changing. Caleb studied her face, noting the genuine concern in her expression. And you think I'm part of this prophecy? I think there are no coincidences when it comes to Zarak, she replied simply. The flight of faith will reveal the truth. And if I fall to my death? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Then I was mistaken, and Vex will have the pleasure of saying I told you so at your memorial service. Caleb couldn't help but laugh. "You're not what I expected from a high priestess." "And you're not what I expected from a prophesied figure," she countered, rising to her feet. "Rest. The ritual begins at dusk." After she left, Caleb examined the robes more closely. The fabric was lightweight, yet strong, and the scales woven into it caught the light in a way that reminded him of oil on water. He changed into the garments, surprised by how well they fit and how comfortable they were despite their unusual materials. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through his window, Caleb wondered if he could simply escape. The window was large enough, and the drop to the street below not insurmountable. But curiosity, his lifelong curse, kept him in place. That, and the strange feeling that had settled in his chest since his encounter with Zarok. A feeling of connection he couldn't explain. When the door opened again, it was Captain Vex who entered, flanked by 2 guards. "It's Tame, outsider," he announced with poorly concealed disdain. "Though I must admit, you wear the sacred robes better than I anticipated." "Thanks," Caleb replied dryly. "I've always had a flair for religious fashion." Vex's expression darkened. "Mock our traditions at your peril. Many hope to see you fall tonight. But not you, right? We've developed such a special bond." The captain didn't dignify this with a response, instead, gesturing for Caleb to follow. They proceeded through the temple and out into the twilight-bathed city. A procession had formed, robed dragon keepers at the front, followed by Tiara and Valdris. Then Caleb and his guards, with Vex bringing up the rear. Citizens lined the route, some throwing small blue flowers that released a pleasant, calming scent when crushed underfoot. They marched eastward through the city until they reached a vast open space, a circular plaza with a raised dais at its center. The plaza was ringed with torches that cast flickering light across the gathered crowd. Above, the first stars were becoming visible in the deepening blue of the sky. Tiara ascended the dais and raised her arms. The crowd fell silent. "We gather to witness the flight of faith," her voice carried across the plaza without effort. "For the first time in 7 generations, Zarok will judge one who claims connection." Valdris joined her on the dais, his aged voice surprisingly strong. "The ancient texts speak of the dual guardian, one from beyond the stars who shall bond with Zarok in times of great change. Tonight, we shall see if the prophecy is fulfilled." Captain Vex prodded Caleb forward until he too stood upon the dais. The crowd's scrutiny was palpable, hundreds of eyes reflecting the torchlight. "Any tips?" Caleb whispered to Tiara. "Don't fall," she replied, then added more softly, "And trust yourself. If there is a connection, Zarok will honor it." Valdris raised an ornate staff, its head carved to resemble a dragon's claw clutching a glowing crystal. He struck the dais 3 times, the sound resonating like a bell. At first, nothing happened. The crowd waited in expectant silence. Then, a distant roar echoed across the city. Caleb felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears, a vibration that seemed to connect directly to his heart. Zarok appeared as a silhouette against the night sky, his massive form blocking out stars as he approached. The dragon circled the plaza once, twice, 3 times, descending with each pass, until finally, with a gust of wind that extinguished half the torches, he landed on the far side of the dais. Up close, in the flickering light of the remaining torches, Zarok was even more impressive. Each scale seemed to contain its own universe of color, shifting from turquoise to deep blue, to flashes of purple as he moved. His 6 eyes blinked in alternating patterns, creating an almost hypnotic effect. "Approach the Guardian," Valdris instructed. Caleb took a deep breath and stepped forward. The dragon watched him, head tilting slightly, as if in recognition. When Caleb was within arm's reach, Zarok lowered his massive head until one great eye was level with Caleb's face. "Hey there," Caleb said quietly. Fancy meeting you again. The dragon exhaled, a warm breath that smelled of ozone and something sweet Caleb couldn't identify. Then, to the audible shock of the crowd, Zarok lowered his shoulder to the ground, a clear invitation. "The Guardian offers passage," Tiara announced, unable to keep the amazement from her voice. "The flight of faith begins." Caleb approached the dragon's shoulder, placing a hand on the warm scales. They felt like polished stone heated by the sun. With as much grace as he could muster, he climbed onto Zarok's back, settling just behind the massive shoulder blades, where the neck joined the body. "I've never ridden anything without handlebars," he muttered, searching for something to hold on to. The scales were smooth, offering little purchase. Before he could figure out a solution, Zarok moved. The dragon rose in one fluid motion, muscles rippling beneath Caleb. Then, with no further warning, he launched into the sky. The acceleration was incredible. Caleb barely managed to flatten himself against Zarok's neck, fingers desperately seeking purchase between the scales. The wind tore at his robes and hair as they climbed higher and higher into the night sky. Below, Casila transformed from a collection of buildings to a pattern of lights, then to a mere glow in the darkness. Above, stars blazed with a clarity Caleb had only seen from the vacuum of space. Zarok leveled off, wings extended to catch thermal currents, and for a moment, they simply soared. The initial terror faded, replaced by a sense of wonder. Caleb relaxed his death grip on Zarok's scales and cautiously sat upright. The view was breathtaking, the curvature of the planet visible in the distance, the crimson wastes, a dark stain against the landscape, and far to the west, the glittering expanse of what could only be an ocean. "This is amazing," Caleb said aloud, not expecting Zarok to understand. To his surprise, he felt a rumble beneath him, not a growl, but something that felt strangely like agreement. And with that rumble came something else, a sensation at the edge of his consciousness, like a door opening just a crack. Curious, Caleb focused on that sensation. The door seemed to open wider, and suddenly he was flooded with images, memories that weren't his own. Zarok soaring over a younger Casila, the city growing from a small settlement to its current grandeur. Generations of blue-skinned priestesses communing with the dragon in a chamber deep beneath the temple. With the images came emotions, pride in protecting the city, frustration at the increasingly rigid rituals, and most recently, a growing sense of alarm about something beyond the crimson wastes. Caleb gasped as the connection broke, the rush of foreign memories receding like a tide. Zarok banked sharply, beginning a descent back toward the city. The flight had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but Caleb felt as though he'd experienced centuries. As they approached the plaza, he could see the gathered crowd still waiting. Torches had been relit, and the dais glowed in the center of the circular space. Zarok landed with surprising gentleness, lowering his shoulder once more to allow Caleb to dismount. Caleb's legs wobbled as he slid to the ground. Tiara rushed forward to steady him, her eyes wide with questions. "The flight is complete," Valdris proclaimed. "The outsider returns unharmed." The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and confused murmuring. Captain Vex stood to the side, his expression unreadable in the torchlight. "What happened up there?" Tiara whispered, still supporting Caleb's arm. I think I saw Zarok's memories," Caleb replied, his voice low. "There's something wrong. Something beyond the wastes that has him worried." Tiara's grip tightened. "You experienced the communion? That's only possible for—" "The dual guardian," Valdris finished. Having approached close enough to overhear, the old man's face was solemn. "The prophecy speaks truth. In times of great change, the dual guardian shall rise." Captain Vex pushed through the crowd, his hand on his sword hilt. "This proves nothing. Any fool can stay mounted on the guardian if Zarok himself chooses to be gentle." The communion is not something that can be faked. Captain, Tiara countered. The outsider shared Zarok's memories. Convenient claims that cannot be verified. Vex spat. I demand. Whatever he was about to demand was lost, as a commotion broke out at the edge of the plaza. Guards were rushing toward them, their expressions urgent. Captain, Highkeeper, one called out. The sensors at the waist boundary, they're detecting anomalies. Vex's demeanor shifted instantly from skepticism to professional alertness. What kind of anomalies? Energy signatures unlike anything we've recorded, the guard reported. And movement. Large-scale movement approaching the city. Valdris turned to Caleb, his earlier composure cracking. What did you see in the communion? What has Zarok been trying to warn us about? Caleb closed his eyes, trying to recall the rush of foreign memories. Something. Tearing. A rift of some kind. And creatures. Not like anything I've seen before. As if in confirmation, a low, resonant roar echoed across the city, Zarok's warning call. The dragon had taken to the air again and was circling in the direction of the crimson wastes, his scales reflecting the torchlight like signals. We must prepare the city's defenses, Vex declared, professionalism overcoming his personal doubts. The Guardian Chamber, Tiara said suddenly, gripping Caleb's arm tighter. We need to get to the Guardian Chamber beneath the temple. The ancient texts speak of rituals for times of great danger. Valdris nodded his agreement. Go. I will organize the evacuation to the inner sanctum. Captain, your forces should reinforce the eastern wall. The plaza erupted into organized chaos as citizens began moving westward under the direction of temple acolytes. Vex barked orders to his guards, who fanned out toward the eastern quarter. Tiara pulled Caleb toward the temple. Come. There's no time to waste. They ran through streets now filling with frightened citizens. The temple, when they reached it, was eerily empty, the dragon fire in the central pit burning low. This way. Tiara led him through a door, hidden behind one of the tapestries, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. She grabbed a crystalline lamp from a wall sconce, and its blue glow illuminated their path downward. The staircase seemed to go on forever, curving deeper and deeper beneath the temple. The air grew cooler, with a mineral scent that reminded Caleb of cave systems he'd explored on other worlds. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. Unlike the blue stone of the city above, the walls here were raw crystal, glowing faintly with their own inner light. The chamber was circular, with a raised platform in the center, surrounded by a channel of what appeared to be flowing mercury. The Guardian Chamber, Tiara explained, crossing to the platform. For 3,000 years, high priestesses have communed with Zarok here, reading the signs, preparing for this moment. What moment exactly? Caleb asked, following her onto the platform. Tiara placed her hands on a crystalline pedestal at the center of the platform. The convergence, when the barriers between dimensions thin and the void spawn seek entry to our world. Void spawn? That sounds ominous. Creatures of shadow and energy, drawn to worlds rich in life force. Her fingers traced symbols on the pedestal's surface. The ancient texts speak of a previous incursion, nearly destroying Casila before the first guardian bond was formed. The pedestal began to glow under her touch, lines of light spreading outward across the platform in intricate patterns. As the light reached the mercury channel, the liquid metal began to rise, forming into shapes, three-dimensional glyphs hovering in the air. The ritual requires both guardian and keeper, Tiara said, studying the glyphs. With Zarok occupied defending the city, an explosion sounded from above, distant, but powerful enough to send dust cascading from the crystal ceiling. Tiara looked up, fear flashing across her face. They've breached the wall, she whispered. Caleb moved to her side, examining the glyphs. They reminded him of the navigation systems on ancient starships he'd salvaged. Complex, intuitive patterns that represented multidimensional space. "What exactly does this ritual do?" he asked. "It strengthens the dimensional barriers, forcing the void spawn back to their realm." She gestured to the largest glyph, which resembled a spiraling vortex. "But it requires a tremendous amount of energy traditionally provided by the bond between Keeper and Guardian." Another explosion, closer this time. The crystal walls vibrated in response. "Well, according to your High Keeper, I'm apparently a Guardian now too," Caleb said, placing his hand beside hers on the pedestal. "Let's see if this dual Guardian thing is worth anything." The moment his fingers touched the crystal, the chamber transformed. The glowing glyphs intensified, casting sharp shadows across the walls. The mercury rose higher, forming a dome above the platform that reflected their faces in distorted ripples. "The ritual is responding," Tiara said, amazement in her voice. "But it's not enough. The bond must be stronger, more complete." Caleb felt it too. A pull from the pedestal, drawing energy from him, but meeting resistance, as if trying to flow through a clogged pipe. "How do we strengthen it?" Tiara turned to face him, her turquoise eyes glowing in the reflected light of the glyphs. "The most ancient bond, physical and spiritual union. The texts speak of a merging of energies." "That sounds intimate." A faint blush darkened the blue tint of her cheeks. "It is a sacred joining, performed only in times of greatest need." Above them, the sounds of battle grew louder. Roars, both Xerox and others less natural, echoed down the stairwell. "I'd say this qualifies," Caleb replied, trying to maintain his usual humor despite the gravity of the situation. "What do we do?" Tiara stepped closer, until they stood face to face on the platform. "We open ourselves completely. No barriers, no reservations." She reached up, removing the circlet from her forehead. Where it had rested, a small mark was visible, a pattern of scales that seemed to shimmer like Xerox. "The mark of the Keeper," she explained. "Every high priestess receives it upon ascension." Her hands moved to the fastenings of her ceremonial robes. "The ritual requires vulnerability." Understanding dawned on Caleb. Ah, that kind of union. As Tiara began to disrobe, Caleb followed suit, removing the scale-woven garments. The chamber's cool air raised goosebumps on his skin, but the energy emanating from the pedestal was warm, almost electric. When they stood before each other unclothed, Tiara took his hands in hers. Her skin was surprisingly warm, almost hot to the touch. "Focus on Zarok," she instructed. "On the connection you felt during the flight. Draw it into yourself, into us." Caleb closed his eyes, recalling the sensation of that partially open door in his mind. He reached for it mentally, trying to push it wider. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door flew open, and once again he was flooded with Zarok's perceptions. This time, however, he wasn't experiencing memories. He was sharing Zarok's current consciousness, seeing through all 6 eyes as the dragon battled creatures of living shadow. They poured through a tear in the very fabric of reality, a jagged, pulsing rift that had opened in the middle of the crimson wastes. Each creature was unique, formed of darkness and crackling energy, with appendages that seemed to shift and change as they moved. Caleb gasped, nearly losing the connection. Tiara's grip on his hands tightened. "Don't break away," she urged. "Bring me in." Instinctively, Caleb pulled her consciousness into the link. He felt her surprise, then her focused determination as she joined the three-way connection. Zarok acknowledged their presence with a mental rumble that translated to something like satisfied recognition. The pedestal beneath their joined hands pulsed with increasing energy. The mercury dome above them began to spin, creating a vortex that mirrored the glyphs floating within it. "The physical union," Tiara whispered, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining the connection. "We must complete the circuit." She stepped forward, pressing her body against his. The contact sent a shock through the connection. Suddenly, the energy flow increased tenfold. Caleb felt as though he were standing in the path of a lightning storm, electricity coursing through every cell. Their lips met, and the final barrier dissolved. Energy surged through the pedestal, through their bodies, through the mental link to Zarok. The mercury vortex spun faster, then shot upward through the crystal ceiling like a liquid spear. In their shared consciousness, they saw through Zarok's eyes as the mercury erupted from the temple roof, arcing across the sky toward the rift in the wastes. It struck the tear with the force of a meteor, the energy of their union transferring into the dimensional wound. The rift began to close, its jagged edges smoothing, pulling inward. The void spawn nearest the closing tear were sucked back into their dimension. Those already through screeched in alien voices, their shadowy forms losing cohesion. But something unexpected happened as the rift sealed. Instead of closing completely, it transformed, the jagged tear becoming a smooth, controlled portal. Through it came not shadows, but light, crystalline beings that resembled the void spawn in form, but radiated positive energy. Zarok paused in mid-attack, all 6 eyes blinking in surprise. The light beings approached the remaining shadow creatures, enveloping them. Where they touched, the shadows transformed, darkness giving way to crystal, chaos to order. In the Guardian Chamber, Caleb and Tiara broke their kiss, gasping for breath. The pedestal had stopped pulsing, the mercury dome had vanished, but the connection between them and Zarok remained, a warm presence in the back of their minds. "What just happened?" Caleb asked, still holding Tiara close. "The ritual. It wasn't supposed to do that," she replied, wonder in her voice. "It was meant to close the rift completely, banish the void spawn. Instead, it transformed them." She nodded, resting her forehead against his chest. "The union was different because of you, because of the dual guardian bond. Instead of rejection, we created acceptance, integration. Slowly, they separated, gathering their discarded robes. The sounds of battle had ceased, replaced by what could almost be described as harmonic tones drifting down from above. "We should go up," Tiara suggested, securing her circlet back in place. "See what we've wrought." They ascended the spiral staircase, emerging into the temple's main chamber, to find it filled with citizens. Valdris stood by the dragon fire, which now burned higher than Caleb had seen before, its flames a pure white. "High Priestess," the old man greeted them, relief evident in his voice. "The danger has passed, in a manner none could have foreseen." Captain Vex approached, his armor dented and scorched, but his bearing still proud. "The creatures, they've changed. The crystalline beings are helping to rebuild the damaged sections of the wall." "And Zarok?" Tiara asked. As if in answer, a shadow passed over the temple's open dome. Zarok circled above, accompanied by several of the transformed beings, their crystalline bodies catching the light of dawn that was just beginning to break over the eastern horizon. "The Guardian seems to have made new friends," Vex remarked, a note of bemused respect in his voice. He turned to Caleb. "It appears I owe you an apology, outsider, or should I say, dual guardian." Caleb shrugged. "Just Caleb is fine, though I wouldn't mind if someone explained exactly what happened out there." Valdris gestured to the temple entrance, where citizens were gathering to watch the aerial display above. "What happened is the beginning of a new age for Casila. The prophecy spoke of great change, and indeed, change has come." Over the following days, Casila transformed. The crystalline beings, whom the citizens named Luminari, integrated into the city's daily life. They possessed intelligence and communication abilities that allowed for a remarkable exchange of knowledge. Zarok, no longer bound solely to the eastern quarter, took to soaring above the city regularly, often with Luminari companions. The dimensional rift, now stabilized into a permanent portal, became a source of positive energy that rejuvenated the crimson wastes. Within weeks, the barren landscape began to show signs of life, crystalline vegetation that glowed with inner light, attracting curious wildlife from beyond the region. Caleb's crashed ship was retrieved and brought to the city, where Luminari engineers helped repair it, using technologies beyond even his understanding. The mental link between him, Tiara, and Zarak remained, growing stronger with each passing day. 3 months after the night of the ritual, Caleb stood on a balcony of the temple, watching as a caravan of merchants, the first to brave the newly established trade route through the transformed wastes, entered the city gates. Beside him, Tiara leaned against the stone railing, her ceremonial robes replaced by more practical attire that combined traditional designs with elements inspired by Caleb's own clothing. "The High Keeper wants to establish a formal embassy with the Galactic Coalition," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "He suggested you might be the perfect ambassador, given your unique qualifications." Caleb laughed. "From crash-landed pilot to diplomatic envoy, my old flight instructor would never believe it. And Captain Vex has requested Luminari assistance in redesigning the city's defensive systems. Apparently, he's developed quite an appreciation for their crystalline technology." "Speaking of appreciation," Caleb said, turning to face her, "how's our scaly friend adapting to his new role as technology consultant?" Tiara closed her eyes briefly, accessing the mental link they shared with Zarak. "He's currently explaining the principles of dimensional energy to a group of acolytes. I believe his exact thought was, these small blue creatures learn slowly, but with admirable persistence. High praise from a being who's lived for millennia." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "The Dragon Keepers have begun training a new generation of acolytes who can communicate with both Zarak and the Luminari. The old ways are changing, but the essence remains: protection, harmony, growth." Caleb reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture had become familiar over the months they'd spent rebuilding Casila together. "And what about you? The High Priestess who broke 3,000 years of tradition." "I prefer to think of it as expanding tradition," she replied, leaning into his touch. "The texts never forbade a keeper from bonding with a guardian from beyond the stars. They simply didn't imagine it was possible." "Lack of imagination seems to be a universal constant," Caleb remarked. "Fortunately, I've always had an excess of it." "Indeed. Your imagination has transformed our world." She reached up, her fingers tracing the small scale pattern that had appeared on his forehead after the ritual, a match to her own mark of the Keeper. "And perhaps others, once the embassy is established." Below them, the city hummed with activity. Citizens mingled with Luminari, their voices creating a harmony that rose to the balcony on the warm breeze. In the distance, Zarak's distinctive form soared above the eastern quarter, where the once feared guardian now taught youngsters the art of flight. "Did you just tame our guardian human?" Tiara had asked on that first day, outrage in her voice. Looking at the thriving city below, at the woman beside him, and at the future unfolding before them, Caleb finally had an answer. No one had tamed anyone. Instead, they had found a new way forward together, human, alien, and ancient guardian alike. The prophecy had spoken of great change in times of need. What it hadn't mentioned was that change, when embraced with open hearts and minds, could be the greatest adventure of all.